Alright, so for this video, um, we're going to focus on what I would call a shifting world order. And in the past videos, we have discussed matrices, matrix, what is a matrix, what is a system, how is it that systems build up into a matrix, and how is a matrix comprised of systems. Um, I also recently uploaded a video discussing the education system and just basically telling how was it that the education system affects and is related to society as a whole, and specifically that the education system has this structure and function which essentially stratifies people into either upper, middle, or lower class, but specifically also like a permanent subclass in terms of like a prison population. So that's just that in a nutshell. Um, and very much connected to that is this idea again of a shifting world order. So we have this connection that, you know, this question of what is a matrix. The matrix being a composition of various systems which, in theory, are going to support and protect life and provide all things which are necessary for both the individual and also for the society as a whole. Every society is going to have its own system. Um, Depending on like what system, that system could be its own matrix if it was its own like territory, for example, theoretically speaking. But even in the case of the United States, you could argue that each of the 50 states are their own 50 systems, and those aggregate into the United States, which is in its own matrix as its own sort of like national entity. Um, excuse me. And so, whenever we're discussing matrices or systems, we're also discussing inherently matrices of power, a hegemonic sphere, which does affect, control, dictate, and narrate essentially the socioeconomic and political spheres of various populations. And that leads into this idea of like a shifting world order. So to first, I guess, like start off with this idea of like a world order, um, and I say it as like a very kind of like loose term in terms of uh, I'll say specific like the G7. The G7 is specifically what has been kind of like normatively identified as the first world. It includes like the United States, along with a lot of like powerful European nations. But that's also important to highlight that when you're speaking of these particular nations, it does come with a particular history and a very particular relevant history that we're seeing actually like reiterate as of today. So I'm speaking specifically of the rise and um, I don't want to say like fall, but the sort of interaction between G7 countries and who are now the BRICS countries. And I have not really heard any type of discourse um, on BRICS in terms of what could be the implications of it on the United States as a nation. But it's obvious that it's going to have some type of like ramifications that we should be aware of. So BRICS represents Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and very recently they've opened up the doors to other countries, and I want to say it's at least 30, 35 new countries which have added themselves to BRICS. And on top of all of this, and I've been um, trying to do my research specifically about what has been purported as the Saudi Arabian um, non-renewal of the petrodollar agreement. I'm really trying to gather as much information, specific information about what that looks like. I've seen one article from Bloomberg, which the author was saying basically, don't worry about it. Nothing is really going to change. Um, but I've also seen other type of like citations, which uh, basically kind of support what I would like theoretically piece together, that once the petrodollar agreement has been non-renewed, not that it has been like canceled, it just the terms of the agreement came to its expiration date and it did not meet a renewal. That's going to have a serious after effect for the American dollar itself, and subsequently any political, social, economic power that we would have. Um, and it would be notable to say that our sphere of power has been nothing less than like global and hegemonic in a lot of ways. But these two powers have been interacting on some level on a plane of power, and specifically economic global power. Very recently, BRICS had actually surpassed the G7 in terms of international global capital, and especially with not just the addition of new countries to BRICS, but also the non-renewal of the petrodollar. It really leads or creates this portrait where an assessment or some type of reflection or observation or analysis is needed, especially in regards to the American people. And I'm not, nor have I ever really been like patriotic, but I think this is definitely some type of um, situation or deal where we really need to uh, take a look at, discuss, and talk about, because while we may think that these are changes which happen from afar, there are also things which will eventually like, affect us. Um, and along with this would be things that we could like already feel. So, um, like I'm thinking about like Amazon, but also like Temu, uh, the corporate natures of those types of business models, which I would say like do a lot to limit like human liberations and freedoms in a lot of ways. But they also like cut the middle class, and they create their own type of wealth, which is only insular to those corporations and not really to the people. But the larger picture is that the economic reality is uh, there has been a de facto numerical financial shift, and we have to take a look at the history, right, in order to understand what does this mean. And if you were to take a look at really any of these countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, or South Africa, these these are also countries which historically are at the um, they were colonized, right? There's no other way to put it. They were the direct um, objects of colonial brutality, imperialism, whether we're talking about the British over the Chinese or the Portuguese over the Brazilian. Um, Whenever we take a look at capitalism as a system, and in the last video, I had mentioned that the specific matrices by which the United States operates is specifically a capitalistic matrix. Um, what that means is that, you know, there wasn't just an exploitation of populations within its border, it was obviously also invested in the exploitation of other countries elsewhere. And this is an example of the fact that capitalism as a philosophy requires an exploitation in order to exist. There's no equilibrium there. The capitalism supposes that the there is no equilibrium. That equilibrium is shattered and concentrated to a very small population instead. Um, and now it's what could possibly be described as the global north versus the global south. Historically, has operated in a way where the global north, also like the G7, you know, has been on top of that particular hierarchy, that self-created and self-sustaining hierarchy, over the global south, the subaltern, the third world, who are the countries represented by BRICS. Now, this is, you know, what we can say of BRICS so far. You know, at least as far as like Brazil, India, South Africa, um, maybe um, Russia and China would be maybe too political, and so I don't want to add that political framework. But as for the other countries, we could definitely say that under the frameworks of what is acceptable by American policy, procedure, and practice, that those countries essentially did earn their dollar rightfully, right? There has been essentially like no issue or no trouble outstanding, um, to a point where like the American urge to intervene presented itself. And I say that because it's just like clear to me, anytime there is a chance for exploitation, the American decision, the American governmental decision, is to exploit, um, whether talking about resources or power by any means. And so, in some ways, it leads to a philosophical type of questioning. Is it rightful? And I would argue, yeah, actually, um, that these countries who historically had been subjected to, again, colonial and imperial rule have now amassed the type of wealth and subsequently the type of power, um, in order to kind of like stand on their own at minimum. I'm not going to um, support or back off of any sort of like whatever. I'm just speaking purely in this particular theoretical framework. But this power is also something that is not normal or historically normal for sake of this continuation of what was like the manifest destiny, American manifest destiny, which I would argue like definitely seeped over into like the Middle East post 9/11, and remained there because like we found like $1 trillion worth of resources there. Um, but the the larger point is now, um, the countries that were once exploited have now surpassed, not only in an economic way, but whenever I think of like China, I think of their sort of economic system in relation to the United States as a very masterful chess piece. Um, we're very dependent on China, and it's very easy for them to maneuver something in response to something we may or may not do, right? I think the relationships between the United States and China has to be very delicate, um, in a lot of ways and for a lot of reasons. And again, there's like this philosophical question, well, historically speaking, you know, for countries who were subjected to very unjust rules, is it not just then to to especially balance that out within that very power structure that was subjected and projected over them. You see, like it's kind of like beating somebody at their own game in a way. Um, and so this is gonna definitely influence the sort of like political power of the United States. The type of wealth that we're talking about entire countries' bank accounts, right? Um, but something else I also want to bring in is actually Brexit, because that's something else that does have to be stated. I would call Brexit essentially like a dish and dive, where basically Great Britain was this person who walked into the restaurant of the world, demanded to eat all the best of the breakfast, lunch, dinner, desserts, the entrees, bossed everybody around, killed everybody who didn't listen. I hate to laugh at that. But it was like a Great Britain and the colonial conquest was basically a hostage situation. That was like a dish and dive situation, where at the end of exploiting that restaurant, aka the world, and taking the best of everything, they decided to dive out of there, dip out of there, and that was basically Brexit. Um, the colonial conquest essentially was saying they took everything they needed, everything was situated as they wanted, and it was advantageous for them to um, cease their official position as that global imperial and colonial colony. And so basically, in a way, that kind of also shot America in the foot, because the sort of economic reality is that, you know, England and that sort of like colonial conquest were in some odd ways protective of the United States, and in some ways, because our economic capitals definitely had this open commerce with those economic capitals, it was also sustaining to us. And so in a lot of ways, Brexit was like the death of grandma, like a very benevolent grandma in a way. So on one hand, if we're now to put it in a historical timeline, because of Brexit, we lost basically our fairy godmother. And because of BRICS, basically the shift and the imposed balance of power, where it in reality was a subjugation on the third world, has now shifted to where that economic power has happened, because that basically means they have money, right? But whenever the PetroDollar agreement has not been renewed, that also means that we don't have that dollar power. And those are two things, because imagine if we just didn't have the petrodollar agreement and we couldn't really be that mediation in terms of transaction, but at least they didn't have money, so they couldn't spend nothing, right? But here you're talking about very considerable very considerable wealth amassing, and because you have all these other countries that are essentially also aggregating their wealth, it's creating its own, in a strange way, the third world it has created its own economic system, which is now more representative of a first world standard of living and being, as opposed to the G7, which has actually relied on the active exploitation of those very countries. So even the petrodollar, again, backed on oil and petroleum, um, or was, and so now we don't necessarily have anything to back up on our dollar, and that's not even accounting for the amassing debt that the United States has incurred, not including still the consistent like $1 trillion bailouts that have occurred, um, at least like maybe 2 or 3 times, um, something one of those. But the point is that the source power that has backed the dollar, um, it just doesn't exist anymore. That was more a contractual agreement than something that we had. A country was just letting us hold on to that and letting us make money off of it, but it was never ours in the first place. It was held by a contract, and in the meantime, between the creation of that agreement and the expiration of the agreement, not only had that country figured out a way to break through that financial stronghold over that country, but it partnered up with other countries that were also exploited in similar ways, and they created their own economic system, so that now it's like its own thing. It's like it's at minimum going to be kind of interesting to see how all of this plays out. There's no real telling actually how it will. Um, I'm kind of concerned actually about the. All right, so in the framework of all things that are theoretical, the only thing could the only thing that could obstruct this potential progress would be some sort of intervention, and by that I mean war. And to go beyond even that particular theoretical, possible, plausible conclusion, not to jump to conclusions, but just theoretically thinking what could in I guess just thinking like an American, what could possibly intervene on their economic advancement, especially ahead of American interests. Um, the only thing I could really think of that would intervene on that would just be like straight out war, or maybe like, I mean, no, it would just be some act of war, or some type of intervention, which I would just find, would imagine would be maybe questionably legal at best, and possibly not public, right? Um, so I am just interested to see how things play out. Again, these are sort of like notifications that had been presented but have not been really discussed. These aren't things that I've really seen on um, really news networks, podcasts, in terms of like discussing it in terms of like what it could do to the American population, or to even present this so that maybe somebody could argue against it in some sort of ways. I'm not really positing this as any like answer or solution or anything like that. Um, I just know that BRICS has been around for a while, that it has been aggregating its membership as well as its financial assets, and it has surpassed very recently the G7 and its wealth. And it's not anything anybody's talking about, although the ramifications can be kind of deep. Um, but within the realm of economics, as far as I know, although I'm not an economist at all. Like obviously, um, I'm more like a social theorist who's really trying to put these things together, and I feel maybe like I'm a meteorologist who's saying, all right, I got this current of hot wind, uh, and I got this other current of cold wind, and now I have this sort of I'm like just observing the circular nature of these two currents interacting, and oh, now look, one of them is going vertical, and now it's going vertical like really fast and has a rotation, right? And it is building up a certain velocity, and it is interacting with its outside external material reality, right? And in very similar fashion, I just see these sort of like fundamental building blocks of power, just essentially, whether we're looking at the contractual language or nature of the expiration of the petrodollar, or the de facto just reality that two is more than one, right? But we haven't really felt or experienced what that means as yet. And a lot is changing in the world, but this I think has to be at least something in the here and now in 2024 that we recognize as, all right, that's maybe a big wave in the distance, but it's still going to be good to just keep an eye on it, because um, it's essentially asking us to imagine a world where the dollar means nothing, and that something has to be said about it, right? So again, this video was about a shifting world order, and I think what that means is like nominatively, historically, since the 1400s at minimum, there's been this global hegemonic dominance, which we could call imperialism, globalization, globalized colonization. But as of now, there has been a shift in the dollar, or the financial prowess, between the countries who were G7 first world countries, who were also the colonizers and the imperialists, are now financially below BRICS, the colonized, the imperialized, the subaltern, the historically exploited, and that's gonna change some things. That's gonna change some rules, you know. Um, the this is important because it gets down to the money, and this person and that person. It could be Gandhi himself, um, reciting a new version of the Bible, floating on Mount Eden, right? But in this real world, the dollar speaks, and so that's why it needs to be pointed out. There's been a very real money shift that has occurred, and money speaks, and it's not even, we can't even say money speaks, right? I would have to, like, huafala, right? That's that's like just Brazilian for saying street talk, you know. And here we have this sort of situation where the street has made the top financial dollar in a lot of ways. So it is a shifting world order, and it's in the hands of those who were the oppressed, and like I'm and so like I'm saying, I've been just sort of theorizing what could possibly intervene on this progress, which seems to be very natural in a lot of ways, and it's still born out of the imperialistic and hegemonically colonial system, which was projected over these countries. And the only thing I could think of is downright war, possibly, but that possibility also like diminishes whenever you consider that this economic alliance with BRICS plus this 30 plus countries also essentially is a political, economic, and political military alliance as well, you know, and it seems as if, you know, maybe the United States bit too much that it could really eat, but the way all the variables are kind of coming together, it seems to be that BRICS is not just existing; it's on its path, and it seems that it's only going to grow, and more conversations about this topic need to happen, and especially by people within spheres of power, because power itself in America is changing. And we really need to have a very clear assessment as to what is our reality, what is our financial reality, our political reality, what is our reality as far as the power that we hold or don't hold. And so in a way only time can really tell in a world that's just becoming increasingly unpredictable. All we can really do is observe when something is forming and try to just prepare as best as possible, you know, and who knows what this ramifications means. Maybe the BRICS gods are really benevolent, and they're the ones who usher in like reparations and things like that in America. Who knows? I'm just postulating at that point. But that's the end of this essentially. There have been like very real kind of like earthquakes in terms of international financing, and in ways that not just over empower the U.S. dollar, but also essentially render it impotent. That we have no backing on the U.S. dollar, but then there's also an emergency group which has surpassed our own aggregate economic power, and is set to surpass that even further, and with that comes more power, basically. So it just seems to be something to note, if we're really trying to think of the state of the nation in a very specific context and framework. But thank you for your time and for listening, and I hope you have a good day.